Almost ready to start.
See, you can,
That was a little bit of a delay. That's funny, it's like, oh my God,
Yeah.
a minute ago.
yeah, so that's what people will be watching on Facebook, they'll see us.
We're just waiting for the other DJ to get off.
Screen.
So right now, no one, well, some people can hear you on YouTube. We're gonna fix that real quick. And we're going.
You don't need no baggage, you just get on board. All you need is faith to little deeds. Don't get ready, don't need no ticket, you just thank the Lord.
Good evening, this is John Warren, coming to you from the desk of the editor. I'm publisher of the San Diego Voice and Viewpoint newspaper, San Diego County 60-year-old African-American oriented paper covering news from both the African and African-American perspective. And this evening, we want to spend some time discussing the issues of housing in San Diego. And it's a very timely issue since tomorrow there is an annual housing conference that's going to take place. And so housing has become a very important item to me because I'm very concerned in terms of our homeless population. And I think that there are a number of things that can be done in San Diego County that are not being done yet, as we have kind of a patchwork approach from moving people now to Golden Hall, to whether or not we allow people to sleep in their cars, to identifying safe parking spaces for vans and cars overnight, to the manner in which police are treating the homeless and the issues involving the homeless, not only in downtown San Diego, but in areas of San Diego community. And so we're going to have an open and a lively discussion, I hope. One of my concerns is that San Diego County talks about affordable housing, but it does not talk about available housing. And when I say available housing, I'm looking at the condos and the high rises. And for instance, I think it's in Bankers Hill, they're building a new unit with 215 units with so many set aside for moderate or low income. And not all of these places are considered affordable. And I'm putting an emphasis on the term affordable because as rents skyrocket in San Diego without rent control, a lot of people have found themselves being pushed to homelessness. And the Voice and Viewpoint did an article about 3 weeks ago in conjunction with the report that came from the tenants union that talked about how sudden increases in rents month to month. A person is renting a place, say for $1,000, and with no warning, hardly, the rent can jump to $1,500 or $1,700. And now we have, because there is no rent control or any monitoring of what landlords do in San Diego, we have situations where it takes a minimum of about $5,000 just to change addresses if you are a renter. We also know that because of the foreclosure madness that we experienced just a few years ago, many people lost their homes, and those homes were purchased by investors, and the investors are now renting those homes back at accelerated rents. And people who once owned homes are willing to pay just about anything to live as close to the standard that they had, now that they have to rent some of them the very houses that they once owned. So this would be a very serious issue, and it's not getting the kind of attention that it deserves. I think there are three things I want to bring up that have bearing on this. Last year, we had Proposition 10 on the ballot, and Proposition 10 would have brought some form of rent control to residential dwellings that were being leased. And the real estate industry and homeowners were sold on the idea that if Proposition 10 passed, the government would step in and start controlling what they do with their homes. That's not the case by any means. The reason that the rent control amendment was necessary, and it didn't pass because those opponents raised over $37 million, and the people in support only had about 10 or 12. So it never really took off. But the whole idea was that all of these homes that are now being put back into the market as rentals without some kind of control, the investor landlords are able to do the very thing that I just mentioned, raise the rents to the point that they're not affordable. And I can tell you that a few years ago in Tennessee, during the foreclosure madness that was going on across the country, the state legislature had to step in and pass a law that declared a moratorium on investors purchasing homes until after first-time home buyers or returning home buyers had a chance to make a purchase. Because investors were buying the houses 600 and 700 at a time. They were just scooping up everything. So this is a part of the problem. Now, before I get to my guests, I just want to take it a step further. Los Angeles has a homeless service authority, and the homeless service authority has consolidated all of the dollars and programs that are there to support the homeless into one place. So that means the federal dollars, the state, the county, wherever the dollars come from, they all go into this authority, and this authority carries with it psychiatric, mental, all of the services that are needed to help people get through the crisis. San Diego County, and I've been telling the mayor this for the past 2 years, and I've been writing about it, and it's like it's falling on deaf ears. One of the major problems here is that San Diego County and the city of San Diego are both charter entities. They're both sovereign under the state law in and of themselves. So the county can't make the city do anything. The city can't make the county. Yet the city has a housing commission. The county has its own housing component. And you kind of hope that people will get together. And so my guests that are here tonight, I'm sure they'll be able to shed some light on some of the things that I'm pointing out, and I'm willing to be corrected if I've misrepresented anything. And so I want to go around the room. The first person to my left here is Stephen Russell, and he's Executive Director of the San Diego Housing Federation. And he's going to be one of the major players tomorrow in this housing conference that's going to take place. And I just wish more people could attend because of how important it is. And then we have Mr. Rafael Bastista with the San Diego Tenants Union. And I'm glad that he's able to be with us tonight because he's going to bring a different perspective to it. And then we have a person who wants to be very quiet with this, Genevieve Fong. And she's also sitting in with us with a great deal of wisdom and insight. So I would like to open it up first, and we're going to spend a little time to this. And Steve, if you would, like to bring some remarks, and then Raphael, we'll just go around the table. People who want to may call in, and our call-in number is 858-251-6111. 858-251-6111. You may follow us on Facebook. We're streaming. And we are also on YouTube. And so if you call in, we're able to take your call on the air. If you decide that you want to come in and send an email, then it's godradio1.com. godradio1.com. And we'll be here until 8 p.m. And we welcome the dialogue and the interaction. Steve, if you'd like to say a few words.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Warren. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I think you really laid things out pretty clearly in terms of the nature of the crisis that we're looking at right now. I'd like to talk maybe a little bit about why we have this crisis, And a lot of it has to do with the housing that has been produced, as you said. It's a lot of the high-end condos, a lot of places that are very expensive to live in, and very few at the lower income. We're seeing places, we'd like to describe the housing production market as a goblet. If you think of the upper income as the bowl of the goblet, middle income as the stem, and the affordable housing, lower income as the foot. At the top of the market, we've overproduced housing for folks who have a lot of money. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that San Diego is not just a real estate market for San Diego, we're a real estate market for the world. We have people from Manhattan with second homes, we have people from all around the world who park their money here, and builders and developers are catering in many ways to that audience. For the lowest income housing, my members with the San Diego Housing Federation produce a lot of the rent stabilized, tax credit subsidized, affordable housing. And that's for folks in the lower third of the income range. But we've only built about a fifth of what we need over the last decade in that sector. We have 180,000 households who would qualify for low-income housing and who are paying more than they should for housing. I mean, I should put it this way. There's 180,000 lower-income households in the county. 40,000 of them have affordable housing. That is rent-stabilized, subsidized affordable housing. It's 140,000 other households in this county that are paying too much for housing, typically more than half of their income just to pay the rent. So that's a real challenge. And when we not only have not produced enough housing for the middle income, but we haven't produced enough housing at all. We've been building, on average, in the last couple of years, maybe 8,000 or 9,000 units in the region per year. We need 18,000 per year just to meet the growing number of households in the region. So we're seeing a deficit of housing. We're seeing that there isn't enough for the middle and lower income residents. And I will tell you, middle income residents do not do without housing. They will rent, they will buy something smaller, they'll rent rather than buy, they'll move into neighborhoods they hadn't previously thought about. It's the poor folks who are the ones who are most impacted by this crisis. When poor families can't afford the rent, they either double up, triple up, or they end up on the streets.
And that's a good segue into Raphael to speak in terms of the tenant union, because the piece that you wrote, which we carried in the Voice and Viewpoint, talked about that path from eviction to homelessness. And I would think that they passed through what Steve just identified in terms of reaching the point where they just can't afford. So please speak.
Yes, again, thank you, Dr. Warren.
You might have to get closer to the mic to speak louder.
Thank you, Dr. Warren, for the invite. You're right. I think the last time we saw each other was at the PJAM complex.
Yes.
And it was one of the many instances where we've seen attempts at mass displacement. I believe there were about 27 units or families that were in danger of being evicted. Some of them were, many of them were due to the fact that management misplaced their deposits or their payment, the rental payments. We got involved directly with the tenants. Luckily, the tenants were already organizing. Monique Brandy and other neighborhood leaders were taking charge. And we were there talking to the tenants about their situation. It's tragic. Some of the tenants we accompanied to the courthouse because the PJAM was following through, or MAC was following through with the actual unlawful detainer, and these were people on disability.
You might
that
tell
are
people
subsidized.
who the initials. We're talking about the President John Adams Manor apartments in southeastern San Diego off of Federal.
Federal in 94, yeah.
Right, okay.
And they're, I believe, right now under management by MAC.
Yes.
MAC project.
Yeah, the MAC project.
Yeah. So and these are places where we wouldn't even expect this to happen. So we're thinking these are responsible entities taking care of the properties and the tenants, but we had to deal with this, and it was a very real, very life-threatening issue to a lot of people.
Well, that's a good project to mention. And again, for those who are just joining us, you may call in at 858-251-6111 if you want to join the conversation live, or you may come in by way of the internet to godradio1.com. Let me just follow up on the John Adams Manor scenario, because that gets to be a very important issue where the tenants were not without some fault of their own. And that muddies the water because they had some very valid issues in terms of mold and lead and all kinds of problems that had not been addressed. And so it looked like at first blush that because some of them were raising questions, that this was a retaliatory action coming at them. The MAC project was put in a very embarrassing situation, I think, at least from where I observed it. I talked to them because their whole concept is one of providing housing, and it was not supposedly
Right.
geared toward putting people out. Did I misread?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we all think, right? I mean, that's their purpose. However, the real life experiences and what we saw firsthand by accompanying the tenants, very vulnerable tenants, to the courthouse, ready to see the judge, coming to a settlement because we were there or because we were pressing on getting a solution.
That was a really challenging situation. I actually worked with MAC as well and helped them connect with the attorney that you had been bringing forward, because the goal was, obviously, their goal is to house people. One of the things I think that people don't understand about affordable housing is that you still have to pay the rent. And people say, and I used to be on the board of the City Heights Community Development Corporation, and our mission right back then was keep the rents as low as we possibly can, which was important to keep people housed. The problem was we were still relying then on rents to pay both our debt service and to try to maintain the properties, and it's not a sustainable model. There are expenses in doing that.
So not to cut you off, Steve, but these tenants were paying the rents.
There were,
And they were still pursuing unlawful detainers.
Well,
And I mean, this is real life. This is, management, ownership, having control over what happens. And the outcome is not necessarily clearly seen by people that are not presently there. And
well,
the whole purpose of what I'm trying to get to is that
another part to it.
there's supposed to be good management. Bad management does all that and then some, right? Bad management, like Michael Contreras or MC Properties, goes after 47 units and hikes their rents between $200 and $400. Bad management uses false just cause evictions and hires Kimball, Tyree, and St. John to proceed with unlawful detainers that aren't valid. Bad management gives 30-day notices to 17-year-long residents.
Well, that's
what we're trying to talk
let's put a
about.
pause for a moment there, and I want to come back and say something with that, but we have a question that's come in, a comment, and the comment says, not only do we have housing shortage, but the cost/pricing are outreaches for just one bedroom or more, out of reach for just one bedroom or more apartments. And the question gets to be, how can this be tackled? I don't think it can be tackled without there being some form of rent control. And the problem with trying to get rent control or fairness in the county of San Diego, I believe that when you go to court, many of the judges themselves are landlords. And so they're not going to be ruling against their own interests. But I want to come back to the issue of the John Adams Manor apartments, because you're right, on the one hand, that people find themselves faced with retaliatory eviction, where you raise a question, they want to put you out. But that situation there was compounded. And I think one of the reasons they wanted to do a settlement when they went to court was because during the month of August last year, rents had disappeared. Checks had been turned in, and they did not post. And so when people came to make their September rent payments, all of a sudden they were told that you didn't make August, and therefore you're subject to 3-day notice and eviction. And it wasn't their fault in terms of what happened. Very few of them had copies of money order or stubs to show. And so I suggested in talking to John Adams Manor that you need to extend this process and go back and look at what happened, because they replaced the staff, they fired a number of people, so they obviously knew something was wrong. And if they fired people, then it's not fair to evict these folks when you're going to find out that some of them are not responsible for what happened. They tried to come back at me from the standpoint, well, we have people who haven't paid their rents on time for so many months or whatever. I said, that has nothing to do with this, because if they didn't pay their rent earlier, you had relief in terms of the courts. And if you didn't do anything then it looked like you're gunny sacking at this point. And
There were
so,
dozens of families being
Yes.
pursued for this issue. And it was, you know, the thing is, when tenants issues come up, you know, if one tenant is saying something that sounds kind of odd, you know, it might be odd. But if there's 30 tenants telling you the same thing and showing you letters of what's happening, then I mean, there's something wrong.
Well,
you
there's
know?
clearly a management failure there, and I know that they stepped in and changed out the management. And in the end, at the end of the day, I believe that 3 families were actually ultimately had to move. They were not meeting their payment schedules. All the other families are staying, and thankfully, the entire
but they were
facility.
they were thoroughly investigated before that happened, number one. And the suggestion that I made and they followed was after this first barrage, that they knew that not everyone had notice of what was going on. So I suggested that they would have people come to the office and individually sign and receive their letter acknowledging what the situation was, and that was a part of the extension. Now, did it come off that way?
We, as a tenants union, we prefer to take action as an association, so
Collective.
we would prefer, you know, for the tenants to go as a
Right.
group. And we did in fact accompany tenants in that situation to avoid the unlawful detainer up to the date prior to the actual court hearing. Now, the issue that I have is that they forced a woman on a wheelchair
I remember.
to come to the courthouse, knowing that we're gonna do a settlement, right? Because they had no choice, because she had her payments made, and that's how.
Well, let's do
Terrible
two
this
things,
thing
because
was.
I don't want us to spend so much time that we get into the micro rehashing of that.
Yeah,
What
exactly.
I'm really concerned about right now, and I want to know the tenants union's position. What's your position on rent control? Do you think that we could have something similar to what's in LA? Or do you see opportunity with this new city council to get them to look at it? We know that the owners are going to be opposed to it at every turn. And the mayor's probably as well. So in a few words, what's the position of the union on this issue?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We're pushing for rent control at 2% in the city of San Diego. We petitioned
At what percent?
2%.
Okay.
2% a year.
2% maximum increase per year. And, you know, we can be flexible. We want construction, you know, we support the building of affordable housing. But it's fundamental to get rent control in San Diego, because otherwise you can implement all the tenant protections you want, you can build as much as you want, but the truth is that they're gonna use gentrification tactics, they're gonna use displacement tactics, and they're still gonna get people out through what people consider usury or rent gouging, or what I consider at times rent extortion, because you have families living for decades in a unit, paying the increases annually, but then getting gouged at a 40% rent hike. So I consider that extortion, because they have nowhere to go, and when they do decide to move to another unit, they're gonna be facing the market rents that are
Well,
monopolized.
And, you know, I want to say so much about that, but I don't want to hog it, because I come from Washington DC, where I was very involved in terms of rent control. I organized tenant unions, and we took landlords to court. They tried all kind of increases per unit and everything, and we did audits on them, and we got them to the point that when they wanted to raise rents, they would come and ask to meet with us before they even thought about it, because it was costing them in terms of going to court. And we had lawyers and accountants that were giving their time
Yeah.
to help us. That made all the difference in the world. But Steve, do you have a comment one way or the other about this rent control issue?
So, you know, our approach at the Housing Federation, we've not taken a position on rent control, but I would say very clearly, there is not enough housing affordable to lower income residents as we sit here today. And our goal is to increase the number of those units that are actually able to be rented at very low rents. And the way we see to move forward is to create those new units, and not just low rent, but high quality. And that's one of the things that you often see especially if a family has been living in a unit for 17 years, the likelihood that the landlord has done a single thing to improve that property is very low. So typically, your naturally affordable housing is not always of the highest quality. It's probably not up to current energy standards, so your insulation, your heating, your cooling, all these systems, even the Wi-Fi or the wiring may not be current. Our goal is to increase the supply of high-quality housing that is affordable to these lower-income residents. But we have not taken up the question
Well,
of
what
rent
is your
control.
position then on, because we started at the beginning of the program, and before we started, we were discussing the issue of available housing. And I don't know if you all have some numbers in terms of available units, because I look downtown and I see vacant high-rises and more going up. I see on El Cajon, they just finished a couple of projects. I understand the rents are just not even reachable for people. And I'm very concerned that the landlords seem to be able to change the rules, like one landlord told a person, and they come to the paper with these stories, that they want me to have 3 to 4 times income for whatever the rent is. And that's not likely in San Diego if people are not in high-tech positions.
No, they want they want to show income of at least 3 times the rent, and for a new 2-bedroom, which is typically maybe $3,600, that's $10,000 a month. Someone needs to be making $120,000 a year to qualify for these apartments. So we are seeing there's a softening of that market. I think they're going to reach a point where there just aren't enough people who are willing or able to pay those higher prices. But what we haven't seen, what we need to figure out is how do we deliver housing to that middle sector? Because there is nothing being produced for folks who are in the moderate income range.
Well, I remember back in the 80s, and of course it was a different attitude at the federal level, we were trying to get developers to build more apartment units, and they were getting all kinds of financial assistance to do so. And they knew when they opened the projects that they were going to have money. Now, one thing I hear today is that when new developments open and people go and want to make application, they're told that the place is already rented, it's already full, and then we still have a discrimination in housing issue. People don't want to talk about it. We can have an African American go in and they can be told that the place is full. Then we can send a white person in, they'll take that application and say, oh, we have room. And even though we got laws on the books and the whole thing, it hasn't changed in terms of that issue. And it's not being litigated as much because people are so busy struggling to survive. If you get an eviction on your credit report, it virtually makes it impossible for you to ever rent another place. And so what's the approach to some of this between the two of you?
Was really enforcing that you could not discriminate against people in renting of housing or selling it. We're in a position in California not discriminate. We have to take actions that affirmatively further the goal of fair housing. We need to create opportunities for people to live where they want to live and for children to grow up in those communities where they have opportunities for education and for jobs that allow them to get advancement. And so we're really talking tomorrow about an equitable economy overall. How do we develop the city in a way that the housing that is built is available, is affordable, and is located in places where kids can actually grow up, go to good schools, and get good jobs.
Well, that sounds good, but outside of discussing it, is there something specific that you're looking to have happen?
So I believe last year's Fair Housing Conference was the commemorative year?
50th
Yeah, the 50th anniversary
of Fair Housing
and they were
Act.
discussing how
The
HUD.
government was responsible. What's his name? Robert, that wrote the book of the history. of
Rothstein, Richard Rothstein, The
Yeah,
Color of Law.
Rothstein.
Yeah.
And, he laid it all out. And he laid it out again at the conference in terms of how the government had really been responsible for all of this.
No, and I think this year is going to be interesting because the featured speaker is Dr. Manuel Pastor, who's done a lot of research in communities, lower income communities, and his newest book, State of Resistance, it's about the state of California, it's a very optimistic book, and we ask what can be done. Dr. Pastor looks at the really dark history of California during the Pete Wilson era, during Prop 187, All of that time, when we were reacting xenophobically as a state, we saw changes in the industrial base, loss of jobs, and what we saw collectively as a state was a change of the demographics, right? And we did that in the 80s. And when he tells the story, it sounds so much like America as a whole today. The hopeful side is that California has in many ways moved past a lot of those policies and a lot of those attitudes to being a thriving and vibrant economy. So what we're hoping to take away today partly is just to have hope, because these are dark times we're living in right now. The national government is frightening, frankly.
Yeah, but the
This is
realities
true.
on the ground in the city of San Diego are still,
The what is?
The realities.
the realities are still segregation. I mean, you know, we had to sue the city of Encinitas for them to start building the units that they're supposed to be building.
Well, let's put a plug right there. We're going to come back and continue the discussion. I want to suggest that for those who want to call in, our number is 858-251-6111. If you want to join us by email, it's godradio1.com. And we will be taking your questions and putting them up. Now, we had a question where one person called in and made the observation about affordable housing for everyone, not just for low income. And that's a very important point, because the term low income stigmatizes people. And one of the things that we saw during the government shutdown is that a lot of people found themselves very close to the very position that they had turned their nose up at and snubbed. And it was a question of, were the landlords going to give them a delay in payment, or were they going to give them notices, or just how was that going to work? And you know, the landlord and tenant law is very interesting, because a lot of people don't know, if we had an earthquake and your unit was rendered uninhabitable, that does not automatically relieve you of paying rent on it. The rent would still be due, because there's no law that says that you get a pass just based on what the economic conditions are. And so we need to have a lot more education. People need to understand quiet enjoyment. They need to understand the right to file complaints. We can't afford to have mold and lead because people are afraid to speak up. And I've been to court on several occasions with folks where the mold was painted over and it was still there in the building. And the city has not been aggressive, and the county has not been as aggressive as it can be on this. So these are some of the issues we wanted to have you address. We're going to pause for a moment. This is from the desk of the editor with John Warren, publisher of the San Diego Voice and Viewpoint. Our guests this evening are Stephen Russell from the Housing Federation and Rafael Vestisas with the Tenant Union. And we're discussing housing in San Diego, which has some very strong implications for all of us, regardless of what your income is. We will be back in a moment.
Have you been in a car accident?
Time
Feel
goes
like
fast
you're
when
about to
we're
feel
having
your
fun,
car?
right?
Your car?
Well,
If
we're
so,
still
you need to contact
can be
the
viewed in
Law
terms of
Center
Facebook, because there's a delayed
There you go.
San Diego's
reaction
oldest
to what's going on.
African-American law
What
firm.
is
For over
the
35 years,
Voice
the
of
law
This is Warren, publisher of the San Diego Voice and Viewpoint, coming to you with our program from the desk of the editor. The Voice and Viewpoint is a 60-year-old publication serving San Diego's African and African American communities, 17 cities, all unincorporated areas of San Diego County. We have a question or comment that's come in, and the number for those who do want to call in is 1-858-251-6111. So LaShawn Hicks raises a question, or comment. She says, rent control, and if the rich need more income to afford their luxury living, then they need to invest more money and build more units. And so the question gets to be, well, why should the rich do so? Because the dollars that were there before to subsidize construction from the federal standpoint are no longer available. So did you want to give a comment to her observation, either of you?
So in terms of the resources available to build affordable housing, the biggest single resource for that is the low-income housing tax credit, which allows literally rich people to put money into affordable housing and for tax advantages, and it helps write down the rent so that we can actually afford to rent out apartments at low cost. I mean, that's the basis. When I keep talking about low-income housing, it's because it is the low-income housing tax credit that is providing a significant amount of that money. We do need more resources to do that. We can't expect private sector. Private individuals want to make money. It's hard to make money off of very low rents, and so we do need to support to create more units. Not only is the tax credit essential, but we're trying to work on a local bond measure for the city of San Diego in November of 2020 that would raise $900 million to, first of all, get every homeless person off the streets. Secondly, it would create a safety net for seniors, for veterans, for people with disabilities and transition-age youth, so they wouldn't fall into homelessness, and would build housing, apartments for large families, 3 and 4 bedrooms, which the market doesn't produce at all, almost at any price level, but there's a lot of families who need that, intergenerational or simply with a good number of kids.
Well, before Raphael speaks, you got these new units downtown. Some are split level fireplaces. Some of those are 3 and 4 bedroom units, aren't they?
Yes, and there's the high-end luxury stuff, and there's a small number of those even that are built.
Yeah, and about how they're selling for how much?
Well, mostly those are apartments. I know you can pay like $5,000 and $8,000 a month for some of these. Or there's a penthouse on Fifth Avenue that sold for $5.3 million that has 3 bedrooms.
Yeah, there's all kinds of advantages for rich people already. For example, I believe if they build more inclusionary into their projects, then they can actually build more units, which could actually give them more profits, but they choose different paths. So there's the Costa-Hawkins protection that they have. Prop 10 failed in removing it. So rent control can't be as effective as it should be, because right now, if we pass rent control, units that are brand new, units that are built after 95, they're protected by Costa-Hawkins, so they're not impacted by rent control.
Well, again, I'm glad you mentioned it. Costa-Hawkins, 1995 is when it was first passed. I did a workshop with some realtors before the election last year in Sacramento, and they all had been sold a bill of goods that Costa-Hawkins was going to hurt them, that it was going to put the federal government into their houses, and it had nothing to do with it. It was going to affect putting forth a rent control policy that would reach single-family units, which were not grafted in under the 1995 initial Costa-Hawkins provision.
Yeah.
And so my observation is that the people who need to benefit the most vote the least.
That's true.
And they don't vote. And I keep telling people that there are 3 things in America that you can use in terms of doing a counter to wealth and corporate America. Mm-hmm. Corporate America is afraid of lost profits. Mm-hmm. Corporate America is afraid of bad publicity. Mm-hmm. And corporate America is afraid of a vote cast against its interests. Mm-hmm. And if we don't educate people to the extent that they will vote and participate, none of what we're talking about is going to happen. Because historically, the people who have gone out on the fence to make this happen have been the very people that were left without the support that they thought they would have.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of points that I wanted make about the
Okay.
question that was proposed. And then there's other things I wanna add to what you're talking about right now. In terms of, you know, how new construction is affected, you know, there's market rate rents that are placed that there's no bearing one way or another. Rent control does not affect market rate rents, aside from it not affecting new units at the moment.
Okay,
We've also seen places that have enacted rent control actually see a increase in construction versus their historical patterns. So it might be forcing the investors, the developers, the people with the money to actually make moves, move their money, you know, now that they're getting all these breaks on like parking and on
well,
inclusionary
Raphael,
and.
the reason I'm smiling, and I
Yeah,
only
yeah.
have a couple more minutes, but the reason I'm smiling is because when the debates were going on over Costa Hawkins, and someone was saying that if you pass this, it's gonna create shortages and all these things, and an observation was made, well, without it, we already have the shortages, so how is it
Right.
gonna make it worse when you have the freedom to build and you're not doing anything
Right.
currently?
Yeah,
So-
and that goes to the city council, right? I mean, the city council failing to do enough to put rent control as something that is true policy.
So let me ask you this,
Right.
a couple of minutes left, let me ask this. Is the tenants union thinking of drafting a model policy to submit to the city council for consideration? That's what the
We've-
lobbyists
we've-
do.
We've all been in possession of the policy, we've all been in very long conversations about the policy itself. Our model's based on the Tenants Together Rent Control Toolkit.
Who's in possession of policy?
The city council members, their staff members.
I haven't seen it. I'm talking about the people. You can make it available to the people so they can know whether or not they want to support it.
Well, it will be when we put it together as a ballot initiative.
Okay,
And we are gonna go through a full process.
Okay.
And we are currently building that foundation for it.
well, here's what I'm gonna do. I hate to cut this short. I commit to having you all back again.
Okay.
Because
Thank you.
obviously, this is not gonna be a one-time thing. I intend to attend part of the housing conference tomorrow.
Great.
And we will be carrying coverage next week in the Voice and Viewpoint on it. And we welcome commentaries, guest commentaries, letters to the editor in terms of this issue because we want to keep it before people. The paper is also streaming live, and so it's available from that standpoint. And I really appreciate you taking your time to come out this evening. I want to come back and do more with it, and I'm committing to doing that, and it doesn't have to be a long time. So after we get through tomorrow, we'll regroup, we'll talk, we'll be open to suggestions. We'll try to laser focus even more
Yeah.
when we come back, and we'll try to generate an even larger audience for discussion. Okay, so I want to thank Steve Russell, Rafael Batista, Sister Genevieve, who sat over there real quiet. I want to thank you all for being with us this evening, and follow us on Facebook, Keep Up With The Voice and Viewpoint, and we're here to support your cause. This is John Warren from the desk of the editor, and we want to thank our guests. We'll be back in a moment because we have a lot of things to share with you in a few minutes. Okay, thank you.
Saturday.
Okay.
welcome. It's a great place to visit.
There ain't no room for the hopeless.
Hi again, this is John Warren, publisher of the San Diego Voice and Viewpoint newspaper, and coming to you again from the desk of the editor. And I have a few things I want to say in a short period of time that are so important. I want to remind you that all of our programs are still streaming and that you can go on Facebook and you can pull it up if you missed a night or you want to pass it on to someone else and they can still follow and see what we've done. I'm going to point out a couple of very important things. Last week I ran an editorial in the Voice and Viewpoint. The editorial was about us without us. And what I noticed last week was that there were a number of meetings going on, and we covered them in last week's issue of the paper, a number of meetings going on. One was RIPA, the act that required the collection of data on profiling by the police. Then there was the Citizens Advisory Board that met, and then there was the Community Advisory Board on Police Policies and Practices that met before that at Jackie Robinson. And the one constant with all of these meetings, with the police involved and the wonderful things that they're doing, was the absence of people from the community actually being in the meetings, or in some instances even knowing about the meetings. Because the RIPA meeting that I went to that talked about the workshop that's financed by people from the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice at USD, they said, when I asked them, where's the audience, who are the people? They were telling me, well, it's for faith-based. But there were no faith leaders there other than the pastor of Bayview, and it was at his church, so he was there. And so we need to wake up to the fact that people are going to continue to have meetings and discussions about us, and they will do it without us if we don't find time to be in the room. And if we're not in the room, they're going to consider our absence a license to do what they want to do. We must move from being reactionary to, after they come after us, to being proactive so that we speak up in advance. And let me just say that proactive does not mean that all of us have to follow some people in the community who are now showing up at every meeting with protests and disruption. That's not the way we get business done. We need to be supportive of those who are supportive of us, and we need to come with substance in terms of ideas and what we want to get done. And so we want to encourage you to read The Voice and Viewpoint, stay informed, not just because we do it, but because it's got information that you need. We live in a global world. We deal with international, national, state, and local issues. And we have too many black people that are being killed by police across this country, and too many decisions that are coming in there saying it's okay, it's justifiable, we don't need to do anything, and we need to just be mindful that we're turning the clock back and we're setting up a place and a situation where after a while people are going to feel it's just okay to shoot us anyhow. So we must get active and not let this happen. So that's one of the major items I wanted to point out. The second item I want to point out is that April is Minority Health Month. Now, Minority Health Month should have a special meaning for African Americans because every survey and study, every health condition there is, they all come back talking about how blacks are disproportionately affected. And I call it a post-traumatic race syndrome, that the stress that goes with just being black in America, just having to live through the stress of people not liking or trying to hold you back or stop you just based on your color, impacts your health. The fact that you can go into a place for service and people ahead of you who don't look like you are treated one way, and then when they get to you, you're treated a different way, and you're supposed to think that that's just the way it is. But if you've been black long enough, you know better. That's not the case. And so Minority Health Month, we're going to be focusing on it. We're doing a special about the third week of this month where we're going to talk about all of the issues impacting us. There are things that we need to do in terms of our health. We can control our smoking. We can control how much liquor we drink. We can control how many sodas we drink and the potato chips and all of this. There was a survey done some years ago that showed that African Americans eat more potato chips and use more toilet paper than anybody else because all we're doing is eating. And we see the fast food joints that are in the places close to where we live because they've studied the demographics and decided that Popeyes, Church's, McDonald's, Jack in the Box, and all of these places are the place for us because we have abandoned that attitude that we had some 50 years ago where the family was able to sit down and have a meal together. The workplace has changed that, the job situations have changed, and so now too many of us are just eating something on the run, eating unhealthy foods and the whole scenario. We're going to deal with those things this month, and we can make a difference. You know, the county has a Live Well program, and it talks about at least 3 things that are responsible for 50% of the deaths that take place in our community. Cancer, high blood pressure, diabetes. These things can be controlled by changes in terms of lifestyle. And so we want to be mindful of these things, and we want our churches to become more mindful, and the schools, because the schools have done a 360-degree turn. There was a time you couldn't buy sodas in school. You didn't have fast foods as substitute for hot meals. When I came along, we had kitchens and cooks and a hot lunch every day. Now you got Pollo, you don't even have Pollo Loco. You got Jack in the Box or McDonald's or anybody except something substantive and nutritional, because it's become more important to the schools to raise money at the expense of our children than it is to provide healthy foods. And so we need to become more mindful. These issues cannot be things that we put aside just because we are watching the president and we're concerned about the economy and how many jobs and the whole bit. Is something wrong when you see a person on the street begging for money or saying that they're hungry, but they're standing there puffing on a cigarette, and cigarettes are costing $8 and $10 a pack. So if you can afford a pack of cigarettes, then you can afford to eat. And so we need to start holding ourselves more accountable. The other thing I want to mention is what happened yesterday in Chicago. Yesterday, Lori Lightfoot, former federal prosecutor, became the first black female mayor of the city of Chicago. To many of us, that is an exciting achievement with Rahm Emanuel going out, a city that's had over 2,900 shootings last year. This is an exciting time for change. It's also exciting because she's not the first black mayor. 35 years ago, Harold Washington became the first black mayor of the city of Chicago, and the people loved him. But the thing about Lori Lightfoot winning is that she is a black female, openly gay woman who swept every political precinct in Chicago. So she, for the first time as far as we know, defeated the Chicago machine, which has been one of the best oiled and well-run machines in terms of local elections in the country. Barack Obama came to us out of Chicago. We had black members of the U.S. Senate that came out of Chicago. So all of this is very significant when you see what's happening, when you see the women who are coming forth, and we must realize that now is the time for us to be prepared to take action beyond just jumping up and down and shouting and saying we're glad. We have our part to do. We got to be there. We got to get involved. Chicago is also the place where the district attorney, a black female, has come under fire because she dropped the charges against Jussie Smollett from Empire. And the police chief and the former mayor, now he's former mayor, lame duck mayor, they all want to bring lawsuits. We got our own problems right here in San Diego. We have a city council that said that it's going to do an independent investigation of the death of Aaliyah Jenkins, and yet today, Reverend Shane Harris held a press conference concerning a Mr. Wiley, who in 2017, in the Encanto neighborhood, was out walking one morning when a police officer did a U-turn and stopped him, said that his walking cane was a stick, went through his pockets, pulled the key to his car out, said that the key had been shaved and that he was really casing cars to break into, arrested Mr. Wiley, took him to jail. By the time they got him to jail, had created 2 felony charges against him. It was on a Friday, and they had placed a $20,000 bail on him. And fortunately, through Reverend Harris and the people that got involved, they got him out of jail. Not long after that, the city attorney and the DA, they dropped the charges, And Mr. Wiley sued for damages in terms of the harm that he went through, the experience that he had in terms of being incarcerated, and all of those things that took place. And yet, with his lawyers talking to the city, nothing has been done. So how is it that 2 years later, we can't resolve an issue with an elder? And that was the point that Reverend Harris was making today. I think it's a valid point. It's not the first time the police have done that in the community. Mr. Wiley pointed out to us that a few weeks later he was walking again one morning and the same officer passed him and rolled down the window, had another policeman with him, and he thought everything was funny. We cannot continue to have these situations pile up, all of these people discussing police. We still haven't dealt with the chokehold. We still have the sheriff who is trying to justify an in-depth custody issue. Who's been invited to come talk to Black Men United about in-depth custody going back as far as November, still has not responded to an invitation to come to us. Seems pretty comfortable now that the election is over and he's in for another 4 years, and people get comfortable because we're not doing anything, we're not saying anything. We don't need somebody else to die in custody before we get concerned. So folks, these issues are still with us. They multiply. We have to choose sometimes between, are we going to make a meeting or are we going to work? Some people are working 2 or 3 jobs just to survive, because the people at the lower end of the totem pole don't have the luxury of just standing around and trying to figure out what we're going to do or spending the evening doing cheers in the local bar. And this is very real. And so the Voice and Viewpoint continues its efforts to be of service. We welcome your input, your comments. We welcome hearing from you. You may reach us on Facebook or you may email to us. And I welcome your input. jwarren@sdvoice.info. We're going to continue the work that we're doing. We thank you for being supportive and for being a listener. And we want to say, be strong. Remind you that the struggle continues. This is John Warren from the desk of the editor, publisher of the San Diego Voice and Viewpoint. God bless you and good evening.
Against the kingdom's throne. So people get ready. There's a train a-coming. You don't need no.
Only got up to